Edward Earle was a silent star of the 19-teens and 20s and made a successful transition to starring in the talkies. But by the early 30s, he had moved into character work. Why? Join me as I investigate. Edward Earle was born in Toronto in 1882. Very little is known about his childhood, but we do know that he came from a well-to-do family and went to high school, working in various odd jobs following his graduation around 1900. He eventually joined the Valentine Stock Theatre Company. According to Q. David Bowers, after a month of training there, he left Canada and rode the train to New York, where he soon found work in vaudeville, appearing in multiple shows for multiple companies, including the Belasco Company. In 1904, Edward starred on Broadway in Triumph of Love at the Criterion Theater. While some sources indicate that he continued to appear on Broadway following its closure, it's his only listed credit on the Internet Broadway database. However, we can assume that he continued to work on the stage in New York until 1913. Because in 1913, Edward made his film debut, starring as Professor Wallace, the inventor, in An Hour Before Dawn, a short from Famous Players, apparently the company's second movie ever released. Famous Players, headed by Adolf Zukor, would later become Paramount. Following this picture, Edward signed with the Edison Company and began acting in shorts in 1914, beginning in mostly supporting roles but also starring in some shorts such as The Unopened Letter. One of his earliest surviving films is The Birth of the Star-Spangled Banner, in which he played a British aide to General Ross during the War of 1812. You can spot him raising a glass after the group of British soldiers overtake an American home. Edward appeared in 29 shorts at Edison in 1914 alone. Also in 1914, Edward began starring as Vance Coleman opposite Mabel Trunell as Olive in several popular Olive shorts at Edison, 12 in all. After starring in several more shorts at Edison in 1915, Edward began another successful partnership in 1916, this time in feature films, teamed with the popular rising star Viola Dana in 3 films: The Innocence of Ruth, The Light of Happiness, and The Gates of Eden. The Innocence of Ruth survives and is a fun film about a young millionaire played by Edward who takes in a friend's daughter, Viola, who ends up causing him to change his playboy ways and grow up. The film was a hit, and Moving Picture World said that the role fit Edward Earle with an admirable grace. Interestingly enough, following Ruth, Viola left Edison for Metro and took Edward with her, where he starred in the next 2 films with her there. In 1917, it appears that Edward freelanced for a bit before signing with Vitagraph, where his first starring role was the very topical World War I drama For France, which also got him a rave review for his acting in Moving Picture World. At Vitagraph, Edward began yet another successful screen partnership, this time with the lovely Agnes Ayres, appearing in several comedy shorts with her, including A Family Flibber, and eventually starring in several O. Henry films with her there as well. He also continued to star in several features on his own. It appears that he left Vitagraph in 1919 and began to freelance again, starring with Alice Brady in His Bridal Night at Select Pictures, with Gladys Hewlett in High Speed at Hallmark Pictures, and with Doral Dina in Passion Fruit at Metro. From 1921 to 1925, Edward starred in several films, moving between leading man roles and major supporting roles. Highlights include East Lynne in 1921, The Streets of New York in 1922, None So Blind in 1923, and the delightful The Family Secret in 1924, in which he played the long-lost father of baby Peggy, eventually stumbling into her life in a series of misadventures. For the remainder of the 20s, Edward moved almost exclusively into major supporting roles, memorably appearing in a plethora of silent screen classics. Highlights include Irene in 1926 with Colleen Moore, 12 Miles Out in 1927 with John Gilbert and Joan Crawford, Spring Fever also in 1927 with Crawford again and William Haynes, The Wind in 1928 with Lillian Gish, and in the hilarious 1929 synchronized sound comedy with Buster Keaton, Spite Marriage. In 1929, Edward made his talkie debut in the part talkie Kid Gloves at Warner Brothers, supporting Conrad Nagel and Lois Wilson, before supporting Colleen Moore again in Smiling Irish Eyes, and then supporting Edward Everett Horton in the Hottentot. Edward was off to a successful start in the talkies, making an impression in major supporting roles in these films. Incidentally, moving into the 30s, Edward returned to leading man status in several films for the first year of that decade. While these were B-movies, he was still the leading man and showed that he still could command the screen even as he neared 50 years of age. He first starred in the hilarious Max Sennett comedy short Honeymoon Zeppelin in 1930 with Marjorie Beebe, Daphne Pollard, and Nick Stewart. Next, he starred with Josephine Dunn in the lovely drama Second Honeymoon, and gave an excellent, quiet, understated performance as a man who is so wrapped up in his career that he fails to notice that his wife is slipping away from him. Beginning in 1931 and continuing for another 20 years, Edward moved back into supporting territory and became one of Hollywood's busiest character actors, appearing in major supporting roles in B-movies and various featured bit parts in several major Studio A movies, with an occasional major supporting role in an A movie here and there. He often found himself cast as ruthless villains. Memorable supporting roles include gangster Sleek Moran in Forgotten Women in 1931, hard-boiled divorce lawyer Joel Mason in Alimony Madness in 1933, greedy railroad owner Frank Bladen in Mystery Mountain in 1934, greedy mobster Barnes in Mutiny Ahead in 1935, Madeline Carroll's attorney in The Case Against Mrs. Ames in 1936, another ruthless criminal, Arthur Stevens, in The Devil Diamond in 1937, greedy banker Price in Code of the Rangers in 1938, masked killer The Wasp in Mandrake the Magician in 1939, Blair Caswell in Alaska Highway in 1933, President Polk in Can't Help Singing in 1944, Jeb Adams opposite Judy Garland in The Harvey Girls in 1946, and Mr. Nolan in The Gal Who Took the West in 1949. You can also spot him in bit parts in such classics as San Francisco, Thoroughbreds Don't Cry, You Can't Take It With You, Meet John Doe, Johnny Eager, and The Best Years of Our Lives. In the 1950s, Edward found another level of success, becoming one of the busiest character actors on television, appearing in major memorable roles in several classic sitcoms and drama. Highlights include Mr. and Mrs. North, The Adventures of the Falcon, My Little Margie, I Led 3 Lives, M Squad, The Texan, and memorably as President Zachary Taylor on Death Valley Days. Edward's final role was in 1966. At the age of 84, he appeared in an episode of Camera 3. Following its completion, he retired after 66 years in the acting business. According to Find a Grave, Edward had married Ethel Gillespie at some point, and the pair remained married until her death in 1948. Following his retirement, Edward enjoyed painting, sculpture, and selflessly giving his time and money to various charitable endeavors in Los Angeles, including the Red Cross and the Motion Picture and Television Fund. Edward passed away from natural causes at the age of 90 in 1972. So we are left with the question, why did Edward Earle slip into character work and bit parts after successfully making the transition to being a leading man in the talkies? Well, I think the most logical answer is his age. He had already aged out of being the typical leading man in the late 20s, and after a brief stint as a leading man again in 1930, returned to and found his niche as one of the busiest character actors in Hollywood and then on television, acting for another 36 years. Fortunately, there are a plethora of his movies to watch on YouTube. From his silent days, check out The Innocence of Ruth, The Family Secret, The Wind, and Spite Marriage. You can find his 2 starring talkies there as well, Honeymoon Zeppelin and Second Honeymoon, as well as several of his villainous talkie turns, Forgotten Women, Alimony Madness, Mystery Mountain, Mutiny Ahead, and Mandrake the Magician. Edward Earle had one of the most incredible acting careers in history, acting for close to 70 years and never ceasing to deliver wonderful performances, different and new with each film. What a talent, what a legend. I must thank my sources for this episode, Q. David Bowers at Thanhauser.org, Lowell Thurgood at Find a Grave, Trav SD at Travelanche, and Archive.org for their digitization of variety and moving picture world. Please like and subscribe or follow this account if you want to learn more about the history of silent film stars whose stardom lasted only briefly in the talkies. Up next, join me as I cover the silent talkie career of Jack Egan. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful weekend.